It's the return of Konami and Data East in NES Works episode 39. After closing out 1986 with the excellent GRADIUS, Konami returns to fill the NES's April 1987 release list with two more arcade conversions. Neither of these games seems to hold quite the same retrospective esteem within the company as GRADIUS, which they republish at every opportunity, but Track and Field, at least, is a bit of an 8-bit icon. The first multi-event sports title for NES, Track and Field actually began life as an official, licensed Olympics tie-in. Released in arcades in 1983 under the name Hyper Olympic, it was produced as a companion title for the 1984 Olympics. I can't help but wonder if the Olympic connection helped give Track and Field its longevity, specifically its connection to the 84 games. Here in the US, the 84 Olympics were a big deal, and became something of a defining moment for the American perspective on the Olympics. The 84 games took place in Los Angeles, the first time in half a century that the Olympics had been hosted in the US, and they followed a string of increasingly dispirited competitions that had reached a low point for America in particular when our team boycotted the 80s games altogether due to strife with that year's host, the Soviet Union. The USSR and other Eastern Bloc nations returned the favor by boycotting the LA Games, which meant the US teams ran the board. The 84 Olympics also gave us enduring icons like Mary Lou Retton and the now standard John Williams Olympic theme. They were, in short, a big deal for a country just beginning to feel good about itself again after a very difficult 1970s, and that warmth surely spilled over somewhat to make its official tie-in game a hit. It doesn't hurt that Track and Field is a masterwork of pick-up-and-play game design. In a lot of ways, it feels years ahead of itself. Its use of a simple, adaptable control scheme across a multitude of minigame events pretty much predicted the likes of Mario Party and a massive swath of Wii releases. Track and Field allows players to compete in 8 different events, each of which takes just a minute or two to complete. There's a pretty decent balance between raw twitch muscle reflex and actual practiced skill, so the package manages to offer something for different kinds of players. At its most hyperactive, button-mashy extreme, Track and Field gives you events like the 100-meter dash. This is literally a test to see who can push a button the fastest. Once the race begins, the 100-meter dash simply boils down to tapping the A button as quickly as possible. It's funny because this utterly mundane race event inspired no end of ingenuity among players to see who could come up with some sort of technique to hammer the button as rapidly as possible. We can't all be Toshiyuki 16-shot Takahashi after all. I had friends who devised personal grip techniques to allow them to hit the button with 2 fingers, or who even constructed elaborate systems at pizza arcades that used a spoon and a straw as a makeshift lever mechanism to allow them to pound the arcade system's buttons even more quickly. Of course, a few months after Track and Field, Nintendo released the NES Advantage joystick with its built-in auto-fire feature, and the arms race was over. Even the most complex events, like skeet shooting, are fairly simple. Skeet shooting is kind of like the clay target mode from Duck Hunt, except that Track and Field doesn't support light guns. And you have to fire at them with a corresponding button when the skeet lines up with one of the 2 auto-targeting reticles. Your goal is to hit a set number of skeets within 15 seconds in order to qualify, and there's a little bit of nuance here in that the more skeets you hit in succession, the faster they come, and the easier it becomes to continue your streak. The most complex event here is archery. There you have 8 arrows to fire into a bullseye in order to achieve a qualifying score, but you have to compensate for the wind, and this takes a bit of adjustment to get used to. As the targets glide past, you have to time your button press and release in order to hit the target on both X and Y axes. It has the most demanding qualifying score requirement of all the events in the game, so it tends to be where my playthroughs fizzle out. Otherwise though, Track and Field consists of second-long sporting events that require players to tweak shared command concepts to accommodate the specifics of that contest. For example, the long jump controls a lot like the 100-meter dash, except that you cap it off by holding up to leap, attempting to find the optimal angle for maximum distance. Similarly, the 110-meter hurdles works a lot like the 100-meter dash, with the additional element of needing to leap at regular intervals. The javelin throw is essentially the long jump with a different thing sailing into the air at the end of the run, and so forth. Being an arcade conversion, Track and Field showed up on several systems before it made its way to the NES, but the NES game is the one most people remember. It looks the most like the arcade game, and it had the benefit of showing up right around the time the NES started to gain traction in the US. Konami would revisit the game with the NES exclusive Track and Field 2 a few years later, a tie-in with the '88 Olympics in Seoul as it happened. And bizarrely, Track and Field for NES, this one, not the sequel, shipped in Europe all the way in 1992 as a tie-in to the Barcelona Olympics. Wow. But for Americans at least, Track and Field for NES is a bit of a nostalgia bomb. not to mention a major sales driver for the ever-popular NES Advantage. Also in April 1987, Konami brought its minor arcade hit Green Beret to NES. It's not a great game, but it's certainly an interesting one for a few different reasons. For starters, Green Beret didn't make it to the US as Green Beret. Instead, it acquired a new title, Rush and Attack. The same East-West Cold War tension that made the 80 and 84 Olympics so dramatic manifested here in a bit of branding that's honestly hard to believe actually made it to market. Yes, the US and the Soviet Union were very much at odds with each other in 1987, though that had softened considerably thanks to the advent of glasnost beginning in 1985. But pitching this game as a lone man staving off a Soviet invasion seems a little tasteless. Can you imagine a 2018 game called ISIS Crisis or Daesh Dash? No, you can't, because that's crass beyond belief. And yet here we are. That said, Russian Attack does give us our first clear sign of the rather adventurous approach Konami would take with its Japanese to English localizations on NES. There was a little bit of snark to be found in the GRADIUS manual if you looked for it, but from here on out it's all sarcasm all the time. And this one questionable rebranding aside, that's a good thing. Look at the other localization efforts we've seen so far in NES Works. Even Nintendo itself didn't bother to revamp its games for coherent grammar. The only real effort we've seen in localizing games for English has come from Bandai, and that hasn't been about making things coherent for Americans. They've just been reworking sprites the bare minimum required to avoid copyright infringement with the Japanese licensed properties that inspired them. But Konami is the first publisher to really put some actual care into the text of their US releases. Not only do you get that iconic silver-banded box art from here on out, you also get memorably goofy names like Castlevania. So this is a good sign for the future. Likewise, Russian Attack's overall vibe, especially its visual aesthetic, sets the tone for Konami's NES library as well. Gradius looked good in a generic spaceships with moai heads kind of way, and Track and Field was all about cartoon athletes sporting 70s porn stashes, but Russian Attack gives us our very first proper glimpse of the Konami NES house graphical style. The hero of the game, the eponymous Green Beret who is Russian to attack Russians, is a sort of lanky, realistically proportioned man with a blank void for a face. He really stands out from the characters we've previously seen on NES, all of whom have a cartoonish look to them, with some clearly defined facial features. Russian Attack aspires to a more realistic look and feel than the usual NES fare, and it points to a game aesthetic we'll see a lot more of in the future. That said, in terms of mechanics, the game itself isn't wildly different from what's come before on NES. It owes a tremendous debt to Ghosts and Goblins, all the way down to the informal "and" in the title. Your fragile little man runs left to right, facing endless waves of bad guys who can kill him at a single touch. This is much less of a platformer than Ghosts and Goblins, though. It plays just as much like the belt-scrollers we've seen, think Kung Fu and Trojan, with the biggest difference being the multi-tier level designs that allow you to advance either high or low. Russian Attack keeps its action extremely simple and extremely difficult. Your soldier can run forward, jump, lay flat on the ground, and attack with a knife. Certain soldiers will drop weapons that you can snatch and get a few rounds out of, which can be helpful especially when fighting end-of-level gauntlets. Rushing against any sort of hazard is an instant kill, so you probably won't be surprised to learn Russian Attack includes a lot of the same sound effects that will be heard in next year's co-op hit, Contra. Enemies run mindlessly at you in endless numbers, so you spend a lot of time pausing to stab them with your trench knife. You can also stab them with a running jump that allows you to attack without depleting your forward momentum. The bad guys don't only run, some can perform flying kicks that have to be met in kind. The yellow-clad soldiers are the worst, as they don't only fire at you with pistols, they're the only soldier variant that doesn't mindlessly run off the screen. No, yellow soldiers will stick around firing bursts of bullets at you, chasing you up and down ladders, and generally ruining your day. They're especially dangerous in combination with other soldier types, since it's tough to duck under their bullets while trying to jump and stab one of the guys delivering a flying kick. At the end of each stage, you have to fight a set of unique enemies that tend to be unreasonably difficult. These range from a couple of dozen guard dogs to guys on flying platforms that pepper you with bombs. Perhaps not surprisingly, I've never been able to make it past the 5th stage boss, a trio of yellow soldiers who parachute in firing machine guns at you at unpredictable angles. And at the end of the final stage, you have to fight off a stream of enemies while snatching the bazookas they drop to fire at a missile that will apparently be launched off into the US heartland or something. Konami made some design decisions here that make the game harder than it needs to be. For one thing, as in Trojan and Track and Field, jumping is set to up on the D-pad. Despite its recent frequency, that won't be an NES standard, but it's especially frustrating here since it means you have a tendency to leap in the air when reversing directions to face enemies converging from both sides. Another annoying jump mechanic is that if you jump near a ladder, you'll automatically grab it. which is fine when you want to climb, but it leaves you vulnerable to attack when you're avoiding or attacking enemies in the heat of combat. The checkpoint system is also pretty cruel. Rather than using fixed checkpoints, it sets you back a specific distance from where you die. It's actually possible to lose progress and end up back at the beginning of a stage if you die a couple of times in rapid succession. To mitigate this, Russian Attack is an extremely responsive game. Your little guy can stab quickly, and you can reverse directions even in midair. It also has extremely generous hit detection, allow you to sort of wave your knife in the general direction of a bad guy to kill them, and always giving your attacks priority over enemies. The 4 weapons dropped by the dull yellow supine soldiers are handy too. The bazooka and grenades can take out multiple foes, as well as mine emplacements, and the handgun allows you unlimited fire for a brief time. So it's a pretty decent game overall, if freakishly punishing. But again, it's mostly notable for the way it hints at much better things to come from Konami. And finally, Data East returns well into the new year to assure us that the old ways aren't entirely dead. BurgerTime converts the 1982 arcade classic to NES, and there's no denying that it feels pretty dated compared to the games flanking it here in 1987. Even so, there's something to be said for highly faithful arcade ports, especially on hardware capable of reproducing them with much greater fidelity than was possible on older platforms like Atari 2600 or Intellivision. Plus, it's a reminder that the NES isn't completely a clean break from everything that came before the Atari crash. I won't pretend to know BurgerTime and its legacy well enough to state that this definitively is the best BurgerTime port ever, but I will say it certainly looks and plays pretty darn close to the arcade version. BurgerTime, of course, is cut from the fabric of games like Donkey Kong and Popeye. You run around on a series of ladders evading hazards while trying to complete a goal. The manic pace and sheer number of enemies chasing you gives BurgerTime a feel reminiscent of Lode Runner too, though of course, that game didn't show up until a year after BurgerTime's arcade debut. With the ladders and platforms and mechanics based around plunging monsters to lower levels to destroy or distract them, BurgerTime perhaps owes its greatest debt to UPL's proto-platformer Space Panic, which was almost certainly inspired by HEIANKYO Alien. Yeah, it all comes full circle here. Anyway, a big part of what makes BurgerTime so memorable is its oddball theme, which is the original Kitchen Nightmare. Sorry, Gordon Ramsay. You play as a guy named Peter Pepper, dashing about a series of ladders and walkways trying to complete the construction of the world's largest hamburgers. Somehow each burger component has been isolated on a separate platform, and the only way to build a burger is to walk across each component, which causes it to drop down to the next level. It's a weird idea, not to mention a frightful health code violation. But, well, that's old arcade games for you. To complete the fever dream feel of it all, Peter Pepper is being chased around the burger factory by various food ingredients, including hot dogs, fried eggs, and pickles. Their touch is deadly, perhaps due to the transmission of fatal doses of cholesterol, but in any case you have to avoid them while finishing off the burgers. Peter Pepper does have a limited cache of pepper, the seasoning not his family namesake, that he can use to briefly stun the militant snacks. And if you manage to complete one set of burgers, you'll move on to a new scaffold arrangement that's even more difficult and patrolled by even faster food items than the last. It's simple, it's strange, and it's hard. So yes, it's a vintage arcade game, and it's reproduced faithfully on NES. If I have a complaint, it's that the controls here are maybe too authentic. To climb or disengage from a ladder, you really have to line up with a pixel perfectly, which led to the majority of my deaths as I was recording footage for this overview. Otherwise though, there's not really much more to say about this one. Now, the top-to-bottom BurgerTime Deluxe revamp for Game Boy, on the other hand, that is one to look forward to. Next on NES Works, Konami returns again to glamour us all into inviting vampires into our homes.